So the next question that I essentially ask people is, who is your customer? ठीक है? Now what happens here? Here is something very interesting happens. Most product managers end up saying, everybody is my customer. Everybody is my customer. Does that ever happen? कुछ cases में होता भी है. If you are building a social networks, right? If I am building a social network, right? Probably everybody is my customer, right? How often do they have the problem? Again, I talked about the business model of Cars 24, right? So Mayank is essentially asking, if sellers are primary, then how it will work. See, selling is something where you have to make it lucrative. Like, why do you come to listen to my lecture? Because you probably understand that there is value, right? Now, if you make my life easier, right? For example, मेरा content अपने आप बन जाए, अपने आप सारी चीजें हो जाएं, right? So you probably would be easily come by because I am selling a very good value proposition to all of you guys, right? So the second question that you essentially ask your customer is, how often do they have the problem, right? If the frequency of the problem is high, right, that means the problem is important or it is genuinely relevant. I'll give you one more example. How many of you people have realized the apps that you use on your mobile phone, right? The apps that you genuinely use, right, are generally on the first fold of the mobile phone. Is that correct? The apps which you essentially don't use are logged somewhere in a folder, somewhere, etc. So you don't essentially use them, right? So you automatically see that your behavior of usage is dependent on the fact what is more relevant to you or what is more frequent to you. Does that make sense? So you have to identify how often does my customer actually face this problem. That's correct. Third is how intense is the problem. Intensity bhi bahut important hoti hai. Like, for example, if you have to go from A location to B location, it's an intense problem. It's an intense problem going from. So Mayank has asked a question. I will take it towards the end, Mayank. We will have a deeper discussion around it. But let me just kind of continue. So the third thing is, how intense is the problem, right? How intense is the problem? Now, if the problem is genuinely intense, like if you have to go from A location to B location, that's an intense problem. You don't solve it. You have to go there. So if something like Uber is there, you are going to use it no matter what. Because तुम्हें जाना तो है ना एक जगह से दूसरी जगह, or you'll figure out some other thing, right? That's the third thing that I try to understand in the who is my customer bucket. Is it really intense? Fourth, are they willing to pay? So I have a slightly contrary opinion here, right? Ideally, most founders or product managers end up thinking that if I'm building a product, initially I have to give it for free. लोग सोचते हैं ऐसा नहीं होता. If the problem is genuinely intense, right, you actually make it harder for customers to find value. Like, for example, if you build a Uber subscription plan and or a Swiggy subscription plan, and you know that you every time order twice a day, right? So you don't really care that if they have to pay 50 rupees extra, right? Because for the customer it will be a deal कि अरे यार मेरे को तो खाना अपने टाइम पे मिल रहा है, अपने हिसाब से अच्छी क्वालिटी का मिल रहा है, तो I am completely okay to pay them 50 rupees extra. I'm absolutely fine. ठीक है. This is the fourth part. Are they willing to pay? इसको figure out करने का सबसे अच्छा तरीका होता है actually make it harder for them to actually pay. Yes, if the problem is intense, they will pay, for example. And the fifth part is how easy it is for your customers to find you. You should ideally know where your customers exist. Like, for example, you build an app कि यार अगर कोई desert में होगा तो वो मेरा ऐप डाउनलोड करे और उसको पानी की जरूरत पड़े तो he will just download the app and ask for water. Who is going to use it in a desert? It's not going to work that way, right? So you essentially have to start figuring it out from that perspective कि मेरे customers कहाँ पे exist करते हैं, right? Then only you can build a complete persona कि where do my customers actually reside. Initially it can be a hypothesis and slowly and steadily you can refine it across, right? So there are 5 statements. 1, everyone is not your customer. Second, how often, whoever is your customer, how often do they have the problem? Can I plot it in a frequency graph, right? Third, how intense is the problem? Fourth, are they willing to pay? Fifth, how easy it is for your customers to find you. If it is not easy for your customers to find you, they will never discover you. The next question that I wanted to ask you was, do you really think your MVP solves the problem? तो यार ये बहुत हिलेरियस है. देखो, MVP जनरली मिनिमम वायबल प्रोडक्ट का कोर थीसिस ही यही है कि इट इज गोइंग टू बी बैड, इट इज नॉट गोइंग टू बी गुड, राइट? Now the problem is most people they start saying कि हम MVP बनाएंगे and by that time they start building an MVP. It takes them months and months. Initially they have started with 3 weeks करते करते 6 weeks हो जाता है, 6 weeks 9 weeks हो जाता है, 9 weeks 12 weeks हो जाता है, and eventually what they launch they didn't even realize what they launched. right? तो उनको इसकी भी क्लैरिटी नहीं होती कि हमने बना के दिया. ठीक है? The problem there is कि whenever you design an MVP, please understand you have to build an internal deadline because it will result into scope creep, right? It will result in scope creep. What I mean by scope creep is the more you essentially elongate that deadline, the more hypotheses are going to change. I'll give you one very interesting example. तो मैं जब BlackBuck में था, तो we wanted to build this interesting MVP of basically एक user experience का कुछ बनाना था हमें. तो what used to happen was, अब हम 3 product managers थे because there were dependencies on like 2 other products also, and there was one very amazing coder, insanely amazing coder, right? वो बंदा इतना चिढ़ता था ना हमारे MVP के डिस्कशन से. वो क्या करता था, वो रात को 11 बजे उठता था और 11 से सुबह 7 बजे कोड करता था ताकि उनको हमारी बातें ना सुनने को मिले, और उसको फिर रिटर्न फॉर्मेट में व्हाट द प्रोडक्ट मैनेजर थॉट अबाउट दे शुड रिसीव इट, बिकॉज उनको पता था कि इनकी ये आपस में ही लड़ते रहते हैं और फिर कभी डिसाइड करते हैं हमें ये बनाना है वो बनाना है, इससे बेटर है तो कुछ बनाओ ही मत, बिकॉज व्हाट वी एसेंशियली स्टार्ट थिंकिंग वी एंड अप बिल्डिंग समथिंग एल्स, राइट? सो what we essentially decided was we will not do this. What we will essentially do is we will give a stark deadline कि नहीं यार, and we will backtrack from there कि MVP में ये होना चाहिए, इसमें क्लैरिटी है, मैं इसके आगे नहीं जाऊंगा. उसका रीजन ये नहीं था कि मेरा MVP will be amazing. That's not the reason. The reason was that whatever I can get, ship out, will give some value and then I can iterate on top of it, right? It is really helpful to do these pre-steps, right? So that you can essentially build the MVP quickly. Typically, the longer it takes to build the MVP, problem drift or customer drift automatically hota hai, right? The best way to figure out whether your MVP is working or not is to just give it to the end users and don't essentially be too focused on waterfall models, right? And just build it across. Don't develop scope. MVPs are by design going to be bad. It is completely okay if your MVP is bad, as long as it is giving you some sense of hypothesis validation. Make sense? Most people think कि MVP जो बनाता है product manager, he's like Steve Jobs. कि अचानक से कोई आइडिया दिमाग में आया, बोला ये आइडिया तो बहुत ही बेहतरीन है और बना दिया. ऐसा नहीं होता. Never works. So there is this theory of fake Steve Jobs. I'll talk about that. Fake Steve Jobs, right? So you never do that. And what is the difference between an artist and an entrepreneur or a product manager? Can somebody tell me what is the difference between an artist, a product manager, or a founder? Dekho, art apne, if you make one painting, right? Even if one customer buys it, right? It's good enough. It's art, right? Or even if you like it, it's completely fine. Right? Second problem is, if Steve Jobs would have built the iPhone and only 100 people would have bought it, do you think he would have been legendary? If Steve Jobs would have made the iPhone and only 100 people would have bought it, do you think we would have called him the legendary artist that he is? That is the point. कि MVPs की वैल्यू तभी है जब तुम्हारे कस्टमर्स आके तुम्हें बोले कि हाँ there is value. Make sense? यहां तक क्लैरिटी है? बहुत अमेजिंग, ठीक है? The startup world is very unforgiving, and I think one of the things that you need to understand is that Steve Jobs is painted as a magical artist, and he just had to figure out how to sell a phone to millions of people. But that is the beauty of it. He had to iterate insane number of times. Okay, I'll give you a very interesting example. How many of you remember the first iPhone? How many of you remember the first iPhone that was launched in 2008? Do you know, from a product standpoint, only from a product standpoint, it was a shitty product. I am sorry, I am saying something very controversial, but it was a shitty product. You'll ask me why. You'll ask me why. अब मुझे बताओ why the first iPhone was a shitty product. Actually, there were 2-3 points. The first point, there was no 3G, and lot of phones at that point had 3G. So practically, from a network capability, iPhone was not the best, right? Second, it only had one carrier which was कौन सा? AT&T. You remember ना, AT&T as a carrier. AT&T was there. But अगर तुम वो carrier पे नहीं हो, you effectively have to buy another phone. You cannot use the iPhone, right? So the first iPhone was just an MVP, right? Even though from a design perspective, it was like insanely well made, right? But from a feature perspective, it was not that good. And eventually, आज हमें लगता है कि iPhone का experience is truly magical, right? So MVPs should be done fast. So whenever if you are in your organization, Nitya, Subhashish, Manik, AB, Vaishnavi, whosoever wants to become an APM, you have to understand that whenever you design an MVP or an assignment or something like that, it has to be executable in a certain period of time. If you're not building something like that, I'm sorry, it's not an MVP.